In September of 2010, you will be coming out with your first book in the new medieval Scottish series,
yes.
Forest Lair, about William Wallace. Can you tell us a little bit about that series?
Sure. In all the years that I've written about England and France and the Holy Land. I've never written about Scotland. And so when it came time for me to look at my next project, my publisher, Penguin Canada, said, "What are you going to write next?" And I didn't have a clue. He said, "I would love you to write something Scottish. You should be thinking about it." Well, one of my favorite writers, not necessarily a great writer, certainly not a literary writer, but a great storyteller, was a guy called Nigel Tranter, who died at the age of 95 about 8 years ago. And in order to get him into his coffin, they had to take the pen out of his hand. He was still writing when he went. He had written about everything about Scotland that I thought was possible to write about. And he had done it well enough for me to think, no, I don't want to be accused of trying to copy Nigel Tranter. And at that point, the publisher said, you know, you have to realize that Tranter was writing his best stuff 40, 50 years ago. Never did successfully penetrate the North American market, other than for Scots and people of Scots descent. And there's a whole new sensibility out there now. People are interested, at least intrigued, by Scottish history thanks to the success of the William Wallace movie, Braveheart. And you also have your own following who would, I'm sure, like to listen to what you have to say about Scotland. And so the
Seems
most
natural.
Yeah, it was a natural for me to once I got over the Nigel Tranter hump, you know, I thought, yeah, I'd love to do this. So I went back to the 14th century, where three incredible characters all coexisted. William Wallace, the Braveheart, King Robert the Bruce, and a fellow called Sir James Douglas, the Black Douglas, who was doing James Bond things 600 years before Ian Fleming ever came around. These three characters knew each other. Bruce knew Wallace, and Douglas knew Bruce. But Douglas never knew Wallace because he was too young when Wallace was killed. But all three coexisted at the same crucible period. Scotland in those days was undergoing what we now call the Wars of Independence, fighting to retain their own identity against the incursions and the ambitions of the King of England, Edward, the Hammer of the Scots. And but the story involves all kinds of things. People, Scottish nationalists nowadays, have enshrined Wallace as a god, and they say he was the champion of nationalism, he was the champion of the Scottish nation. There was no Scottish nation when Wallace was alive. That's what these wars were all about, and it was only as the outcome of these wars that what we now think of as nationality and nationhood emerged. Before that, it was a feudal system. The very first king to create a nation state was alive and well and living in France at the time, Philip IV, Philippe le Bel. He was the man who perfected the French nation state, which became the first nation state in what at that time was called Christendom. A whole confederation of Christian countries making up Christendom, which eventually, within the next 200 years, evolved into Europe. So the story of Sir William Wallace, the Braveheart, and Robert the Bruce, and the wars between Scotland and England involved the French king. It's all about the end of the feudal system in Europe and the emergence of this new entity, which would become...
He's the symbol of that emergence.
Yes,
he wasn't
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But we talk, you know, people will tell you that Wallace was the first free man in Europe. But he escorted the emergence, he made possible the emergence of a new class within society that in France today is called the bourgeois, and in Britain they were called burgesses. They were the inhabitants of the boroughs that had been built as walled towns to fend off the Vikings. And because they were walled towns, they offered refuge to a new class, an emerging merchant class, who became merchants and traders and they built factories, and they became the middle class, which made Europe possible. So it's really complex, really fascinating, and a really great story.
Yeah, it's good that you're telling it